web fiction has returned. For the first time since the Nicky Drayden Ravnica stories, we have free, accessible web fiction to accompany the latest set, Zendikar Rising. With returning characters, both surprising and telegraphed, and a mix of main plot and side stories, is this return a triumphant one? And where can Magic Story go from here? Welcome to Magic the Flavouring, the Magic the Gathering podcast, where we talk about all things Magic flavour design and lore. I'm your host, Andy Mann.
Hello, this is Nathan Cancel.
And we finally get to talk about the lore stuff. Like every episode we start with, this is Magic the Flavouring, where we get to talk about all things Magic flavour design and lore, and we've been doing a lot of flavour and a lot of design, because quite frankly, the lore has been lacking over the past year, even with a couple of ebooks, and now we actually finally get to look at some actual, factual web fiction lore. And I am super happy with it. Like, I don't mind telling you, like, right off the bat, like, this is going to be a review episode. So if you're joining us here and you haven't read the online web fiction, either the main stories or the side stories, because we are going to be talking a bit about all of it, I would stop the episode now, go read those and come back, because we're going to be doing major spoilers. And we're also not going to be doing, like, an in-depth story breakdown. I'm going to run through some bullet points, and then we're just going to talk about broad themes. So if you are basically looking for, like, a cheat sheet for what happens in the story, this might not also be the episode for you. But if you want to look at, if you've read the stories, if you know what's happened in Zendikar Rising, and you want to kind of discuss the broader themes, then this is what we're here to do today. And we have had 2 ebooks. So I was thinking about this, Nathan, just before like we kind of continue down the road of, we've got web fiction back. There hasn't been no lore to discuss, right? There's not been no story, because we have had ebook since War of the Spark, which is kind of the cutoff for where I think people went, the story's in a little bit of trouble, because that's where everything went terribly wrong with those Greg Wiseman books, the War of the Spark Ravnica stories. People were worried about where the story was going to go. We even did a whole like state of the story episode, which was one of our first sort of big episodes that we did for this podcast. But there have been 2 ebooks. We had The Wilded Quest by Kate Elliott, and we had The Sundered Bond by Django Wexler. So there has been lore and storyline. But I think one of the big problems is, and the reason people were so excited to get the web fiction back, is because even though we've had these novellas, essentially these ebooks, written by established writers who have been part of Magic the Gathering previously. Kay Elliott did the C19, the M19 Nick Bolas stories. Django Wexler did some of the better Ravnica fiction that was out at the time of War of the Spark. So that's obviously not the problem. The problem is that these books seemed just too detached, kind of graduating to doing the ebook format rather than the web fiction, which, as someone who at the time thought it was going to be like a graduation, I guess is the right word, not a legitimization, because that makes it seem like the web fiction wasn't legitimate literature, but it was like a graduating to maybe a form that people who didn't play Magic could pick up and read in the form of physical and ebook copies. I was all for it, even if you did have to pay for it a little bit. But I think the big problem that in hindsight everyone's kind of come to realize is that it's not to do with the writers, because even having one writer take on a whole story is fine, because we've had it with, Alison Lurs, for example, did one of the most lauded story arcs in the Ixalan stories. It was all her. Nicky Drayden did all of the Ravnica stories, like leading up to the War of the Spark stuff. It was the fact that when you start taking the ebook novella stuff and then removing it from the in-house team at Wizards, even if you give them information to go off and work off of as writers to kind of craft a Magic story, that one level of separation, suddenly the whole house of cards falls, and the story is intrinsically linked to the card game. So the further you push it away from the card game, the more upset people who are invested in both, or one or the other, are going to be. So the fact that it's come back to web fiction, the fact that even though it's 4 different writers who I think are mostly new to Magic, although I could be wrong on that, I didn't check that, the fact that it's back pretty much in-house and they're being published on the mothership, and there is direct support from Wizards to actually have this narrative follow through more or less with what the cards are doing. It's just, it's been an absolute joy. I don't mind telling you, I absolutely loved these stories. I know it's not cool to like things in this current climate. I know, people are very quick to be down on almost everything, and I have seen discourse online, as with everything, where people have both liked and despised these stories for what they've done to Zendikar and whatever else. But I've absolutely loved them. I think they're great. I mean, what before we jump into it, like, what are your kind of broad feelings about the Zendikar stories?
Yeah, I think this is a good example of kind of the direction that we wanted things to go in, where everything feels a bit more intrinsically connected. Everything from the trailer. I mean, one of the episodes literally follows the outline that the trailer followed, and then the fact they feel more in it immersed within the story of the cards themselves as well. It creates a great meta narrative. The problem when you have like an ebook that has a divorce storylines and that has some disassociation, some dissonance from what you see on the cards, the fact that the story cards themselves, like the story spotlight cards, might not follow the exact things. Or if, to be fair, even if those 5 spotlight cards are the only bit of story you get grounded in the set, like say for example Ixalan, where you had things like the not unexplained vision. I can't remember what the 5 mana one is now. But the say for like Cameron's transformation, that kind of thing. If you were looking specifically in the set for the story, you only got those 5 story cards. I mean, that's not a lot, especially considering the trailer didn't really follow anything that was in the set, and the trailer didn't follow anything that kind of really happened in the books at all. And the book was a very nice, good story, but it didn't have that grounding. It didn't feel like it was birthed from the set. It felt like it was someone looking at the set from a story lens instead of from a set lens, whereas this feels like it's both things intertwining and integrating together.
Yeah, for sure. Like the Ikoria and the Eldraine stories told... it was almost like... I always described it as like an alternate reality of what the multiverse is. I was about to say an alternate universe, but that is what a multiverse is. It was almost like... It's almost like when you get in comic books, you get, your superheroes from Earth, 616, and then you get your superheroes from Earth like AB215. That second one, that's not a comic book one. Earth 616 is another one. But like, it's the same characters and it's the same central setting, but with key components changed. And that's how I'm kind of justifying those ebooks in my head canon. It's almost like it's a separate multiverse which has almost the same stories, and that's kind of, it will give you the general gist of everything that's going on, but when it actually comes down to what's going on the cards, and this whole podcast is about how the cards and the game itself can be used as a narrative, when the actual narrative that goes along with these card games is so disassociated, things start to get very muddy. And Vorthos, Magic players are some of the most outspoken and passionate, because it's a passionate thing to be kind of about,
We're also one of the hardest to please, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, but I think it's because we're invested.
We're quite precious, yeah.
Yeah, we're invested. So yeah, as a return to web fiction, even though mostly people have had some issues with maybe some of the story threads that were chosen to follow, or maybe some of the things that were not chosen to highlight, especially for a fan favorite plane like Zendikar. I think for the most part, everyone is broadly happy that we're back to this level of things. And it also goes to show to people like Wizards, and this isn't going to be like another holier than thou episode about, Wizards needs to philosophically think about this, that, the other as a company, because God almighty, I mean, I don't know about you, mate. I'm exhausted with, pontificating on what Wizards should and shouldn't do, especially like with recent events going on. But this is something that shows Wizards of the Coast that actually you don't need to push the envelope so far with these stories that, I think their jump to doing the ebooks, as I say, was them trying to think of Magic as being beyond the game somewhat, which is noble and worthy and fine. But actually, it's better when it's all tied closely and when it's all kind of knitted together tightly within an in-house team who really care about what they're doing. And that's no diss on Kate Elliott or Django Wexler, and it's no diss on Greg Wiseman. He fucked it, but also it was a bit of an impossible task, as we said in the past. Don't want to flog the dead horse of us having a go at Greg Wiseman, but it's better when it's monitored a bit closer in.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of story that if they did like story articles for War of the Spark, it would have been months of story articles, because there had been so much that you needed to fit in, so much you would have felt like you needed to do justice for. So I think maybe in the grand scheme of things, a 2-book series was probably objectively the right choice. It's just obviously in hindsight, it didn't pan out effectively.
I mean, they did the 2 books, and then they still did a bunch of articles anyway. They just did it in really convoluted manners. But we're not here to talk about War of the Spark. What we are here to talk about today is Zendikar Rising. So there were 5 main story articles, and then there were 4 side story articles, which is different to how they've done it before. This is the first thing what I think is quite interesting, because the way that it used to be, at least, I mean, they always changed it up. They always kind of experimented. But broadly speaking, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was, they did back way when, outside of the novels, because they did used to do novels as well, which were at the time, even then, not really well received either. So why they went back to it is a bit of a mystery. But as far as web fiction goes, they used to do sort of one-shot stories about legendaries when we visited planes, and then around the time of Tarkir, I believe it was Tarkir, they started doing web fiction where it was an actual story arc that followed the full-on story. Was it Tarkir that was the first one? The
Mm-hmm.
as in terms of full-on web fiction story arcs. I know that
I
was one of
believe
the best received ones.
that's one of the. I think that's one of the best receivers. So that's why it's more sticks in people's minds.
Yeah, for sure. They used to do these like fuller arcs where it would do the whole set, and especially when we were back in the block format, when we had 3 sets of magic per plane, they could carry on that narrative for quite a while. And they could, especially with something like Fate Reforged, where Dragons of Tarkir, where you had 3 sets that were all like time jumpy and time hoppy as well. You had quite a broad narrative to tell, and they did this all the way up to Ravnica, Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, and then they stopped that in favor of what they thought were going to be the ebooks. That was the way that we were going to move forward. We didn't get one for Theros. We got one for Ikoria, got one for Eldraine. We didn't get one for Theros. People think that there's a kind of half valid rumor going around that we do actually have somewhere in the vaults at WotC a story for Theros, but there's rumors that it was written by Greg Wiseman, so they didn't want to release it because of how it was received War of Spark. And then there are other rumors saying that because of just how poorly the storylines had been received broadly since the whole kerfuffle with the War of the Spark novels, they didn't want to release another thing, so they stopped it halfway through the production of the story and have a bit of a palate cleanser. Now we're back to the web fiction, so this is where we are, and I kind of hope this is where we continue to go through. Let's say they changed it up with the side stories and the main stories, and I think this was kind of a good move, because it gives the main story enough room to breathe whilst also not just focusing on the core collection of characters, which invariably will be the Planeswalkers. And people, even now, are a little bit fatigued with Planeswalkers as a group, even though I think, as we discussed on a previous episode, it's been like a year since we've had a new Jace or a new Nissa card, like, to kind of delve into lore-wise. But people are still a little bit like, maybe a little bit done with these characters. And then they did 4 side stories, which focused on the actual inhabitants of the plane of Zendikar this time round, and kind of fleshed out some of the stuff which people wanted to get with the nitty-gritty with the legendary creatures. And I think this was a good move, doing it as 2 split things, because it gives people more options, right? Whereas with so Shadows over Innistrad is a good example. Like, I know that's a storyline that both me and you really like, is the Shadows over Innistrad arc. And they would do episodes where it was just talking about the Gitrog monster, or talking about Halana and Elena, the werewolf hunters, and it's just their little stories going off without really any influence of the Planeswalkers. But then there would be like the main sort of bulk of the stories were about Jace and Liliana and whatever else. But they were all kind of mushed together. There was no separation of them. There was just like, this week is going to be this thing, and this week is going to be this thing. Whereas for the Zendikar stories, they've done 2 stories per week. One's a side story, one's a main quest line. And that way you can kind of pick and choose what you want to read at your own pace, which I think is quite a cool idea. I mean, what was the balance like for you with the main line story and sort of the side story? Do you think it was a good mix-up?
I think it was. I think the surprising thing for me was the fact they did the 2 alongside each other. Like, I know we talked about this in a previous episode about the disjointed nature of bouncing. If you're reading it chronologically, then obviously the story kind of does bounce between 2 different timelines and 2 different arcs. The thing that I thought was interesting is that they ended up squeezing essentially all of their story into a month and a week, instead of allowing. What I think could have done is they could have done the Ikoria and Zareth sideline as the first 2 episodes, then done the main story episodes, the 5 stories of those, and then do the 3rd and 4th side episodes of Abarm and Akum, and done Anawan, Abarm and Anawan, done those as the last 2 episodes, episode 8 and 9, right at the end afterwards, because by that point we've had enough time to play around with the decks, and then you can get a bit of perspective, and it kind of gives almost like a precursor to the main story, getting a bit of background with Ikoria and Zareth and understanding how Zendikar is in that stance, and then hitting the main story. I don't think it would have mattered too much. I don't think there was enough like spoilers within like the set or anything that would have ruined the story. Whereas there are some storylines that you very much wanted to come beforehand. Otherwise, you were just going to get everything ruined for you, like, say, War of the Spark, where we're kind of like, well, we already know everything that's going to bloody happen. So it doesn't really matter that I read the book. I've already got the story points in the sets or whatever. That was confusing for me because I think then not only did you end up, now we've got another gap of story. And from what I know, that Legends might not have these articles. So, Commander Legends might not have these articles. There might be quite a bit of a gap before we get more. So it felt weirder to do it all kind of smushed together. I think it was good to have both at the same time. I do like the balance of having things outside of the main arc as well as things within the main arc. So it gives a bit of perspective and subjective kind of storytelling. Problem being that I think when you put them both together and squeeze it all together, it felt like a flash in the pan, maybe a little bit disjointed. And it also made me not really care about the Obama and the Anawan stories as much, because by that point you've already got the finalization. Maybe that would have been worse had we waited to put it right at the end and only done one a week. So yeah, maybe it felt rushed. Beyond that, I still like the fact they did the two perspectives.
Sure. I mean, it was what we said about the Nikki Drade and Ravnica stories, that the 10 individual ones which focused on each guild individually as like a slice of life piece. They would have been perfect to have come before the War of the Spark stuff. It's just the problem is the War of the Spark stuff there was too much of a lead in with those stories that there wasn't any progression with the main plot line. So maybe those could have been the supplemental stories, and then the main plot line could have come in and punched through as being the main thing to read. So actually this format of having main storyline, side storyline with different tabs on the Magic story as well, so you can actually physically flip between them, which is a nice little touch. Maybe that would have worked back in 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
Whenever the lifetime ago that was Ravnica Allegiance and Guilds of Ravnica. Like it feels like a full lifetime ago that happened. We're not going to talk too much about the side stories today. We're going to be talking about the main story, if only because that is where a lot of the narrative gets pushed through and where maybe some of the more interesting stories are being told. I will say, though, that all of the authors for these stories have been really good. Miguel Lopez, for example, who wrote Red Root and the Magosi Steps in the side stories, very good writer for Magic.
Yeah, I'm going to keep an eye on him. Any future works that he does, I'm going to keep a keen eye and great interest on, because he's got a very good way with words.
Yeah. Very uses a lot of like higher language and higher writing, like, which what I mean by that is that Magic is sometimes accused of being a bit too colloquial for a fantasy setting, and Miguel Lopez certainly doesn't write like that. So I'm really happy with that. Then we have AZ, Louise, and Brandon O'Brien, or Brienne. Oh, Brandon O'Brien, I'm going to go with for the side stories. I should know that. I've got Irish family. And then for the main story, we have A.T. Greenblatt does all 5 of the main narratives. All of these writers I thought were very, very good. And I hope to see more of them in the future.
I think it was a good idea to do the same author for all of the main story, because then you get the same voice, the same kind of perspective, and then you don't have this disjointed handling of characters, where specifically the main storyline was, as we'll talk about these arcs for these 3 planeswalkers. And I think had they done the thing where they bounce between different writers, that would not have carried, and I think it would have felt really weird.
I agree. I mean, the first 2 stories by Miguel Lopez, as we discussed again in a previous episode when we were being really hyped about Zendikar, did actually surround the characters of Ikoria and Zareth, who come into the main storyline and are actually quite a key part of the main storyline. But because they were 2 different writers, even between just the couple of stories that they feature in on either side of the main and side stories, the disjointed voice, because it's just a different writing style, was a little bit jarring. So I agree, if they'd done that the whole way through, because they used to have different in-house writers write a different episode of the story each week, but usually the story arcs weren't quite so like each week could have been something completely different, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, this is very entwined. This was it's almost like it was written as one piece and then split, obviously, into chapters rather than having each chapter written individually. Plus, also, this is where they're having both the side story and the main story get released in the same week. Well, after that, could have felt a bit strange, because not only are we getting different timescales, but we're also getting different voices speaking of the characters. So I think that's where that come full circle back to that idea of maybe don't do them all at the same time kind of thing. But beyond that, it was nice to get a different perspective on them, and then have the same characters represented across the main story by the same writer.
Sure, exactly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very, very quick rundown of what happens plot point by plot point in the main storyline. This isn't going to be any means a deep dive into like the nuances of the plot, because we're going to get onto that in a minute. But this is just a refresher. If you finish the stories, say a week or more ago, and you kind of go, oh, I can't really remember what happened in the first episode, I'm just going to give you super flyby rundown of what happens. I'm going to attempt to do this in under 3 minutes.
Lightning round.
We waffle so much. I mean, that's a nice callback to like one of our like first 5 episodes called Lightning Round. Lightning Bolt Round. So there we go. So I'm going to try and do this as quick as possible. This is the main storyline. Okay, right, so we open up with Nissa and Nahiri exploring a skyclave on Zendikar, and they discover info about something called the Lithiform Core, which is an ancient core artifact. There's going to be the word core a lot in this, said to be able to fix Zendikar in some kind of way that we don't quite know yet. The Planeswalkers find the key, which will show them where this core is going to be, and the key itself also has a similar power, and they witness that the power within these ancient core race artifacts is actually very destructive and could potentially destroy all the flora and fauna in Zendikar, something which Nissa is opposed to, but Nahiri seemingly doesn't care, because all she cares about is the fact that these artifacts seem to stop the royal. Nissa goes off to recruit Jace to her cause, thinking that if she has Jace on side with her, they can both face off with Nahiri and keep the ancient core artifacts for themselves. Nahiri, in turn, goes off to find an adventuring party in the form of Akiri, Zareth, Kaza, and Ora, who represent the 4 different classes that are part of the party mechanic and are all legendary creatures in their set in their own right. Nahiri, then, with her adventuring party, goes off to another skyclave and finds the Lithiform Core artifact. Unfortunately, with an altercation which happens during this expedition, she uses the Lithiform Core to not only destroy an elemental that appears in the skyclaves, but also to kill Zareth, which causes Akiri, who is Zareth's romantic partner, as well as being an adventuring partner, to turn on Nahiri and essentially try and take the core for herself to keep away from the Planeswalker. Nahiri reacts to this by freezing Akiri with a Hedron and then pushing her off of the skyclave with the core back in hand, which is what we see in the trailer.
Yeah.
Nissa and Jace, after some initial disagreements with what they should do with these ancient artifacts, do eventually catch up to Nahiri and even save Akiri in the moment that she falls off of the Skyclave cliffs. And then essentially Jace and Nahiri and Nissa get caught up in a large battle between the 3 of them. During this battle, Jace and Nahiri find themselves in a location called the Singing City on Zendikar, which is a hub of the core race power, and they form a temporary truce because Jace at this point basically doesn't quite know what his own intentions are with this Lithiform core. He thinks that potentially they could use it as a weapon for future battles, so he's not fully on side with Nissa, but he also understands that Nahiri is potentially too destructive to have this artifact in her possession. They form a temporary truce in this trap-laden ancient core city, and they find that the sort of altar where the Lithiform core could do its most sort of powerful shenanigans has already been destroyed by Nissa, who turns up with Ashaya, who is the Zendikar world soul, and Ashaya is in the form of this giant elemental. Nissa and Ashaya basically go on to kick the shit out of Nahiri and a little bit of Jace as well. Nahiri does fight back to some sort of degree of, prowess, but I think she eventually finds out that she's outmatched, and Jace is very much caught in the middle of his allegiances. Eventually, Nissa gets hold of the Lithiform core, and she starts to hear a voice which is revealed to her in the moment to be the voice of Zendikar speaking to her, not through the elementals, but through the stone core artifact that she eventually gets hold of. Nissa then decides that she's going to use the artifact herself to fix Zendikar in her own way, and she uses it to create a mass explosion of power that at first seems to have destroyed all the flora and fauna in the area, but actually turns out it was just an expulsion of power, and Zendikar, at its very core, seems to be starting to heal again with this explosion of power. Jace then looks all moody, because that's what Jace does, and doesn't quite know where he goes from there. Nissa goes off all joyous that she's now basically reunited with the Zendikar that she loves, and Nahiri Plains walks away, yet again, slightly bitter and defeated, which seems to be her perpetual sort of mood, really. And there we go. That's it from start to finish. Not a huge story, to be honest, if you look at it like that. There's, Planeswalkers want to get an artifact. They go get the artifact. They fight over it. One of them wins in the end. So that's the story across 5 different episodes. Yeah, I mean, as far as Zendikar stories goes and things that you could talk about Zendikar, it was quite interesting to do like a race for a MacGuffin, as opposed to, we're so used to seeing things like Eldrazi and big titans and monsters smashing the place up. Now, it was actually quite nice to see something maybe a little bit more contained, even though it was about the fate of Zendikar. It didn't feel as kind of grandiose and expanding as potentially it could be. I
Mm.
mean, how did you feel about it?
Well, as you said it there, it kind of felt like an Indiana Jones film. You know, like the
Yeah.
typical cliche arc of, and this is kind of what Zendikar should have been from the beginning. This idea of an adventuring plane, of where you get your little party together, you go and plunder some ruins. There's probably some traps and some monsters that you need to fight. There's probably obviously a bit of forced animosity between the characters, as there always is in media, and then obviously a resolution that culminates after a big battle, and hopefully it ends with everyone being kind of like, hey, okay, everything's kind of cool again, which it was.
Yeah.
It was nice to have a nice contained grounded story that wasn't so, because I was kind of a bit frustrated that we did just go back to, we can kind of ignore the reality of Zendikar, but then I've also had a bit of reflection on that and realized it's been 2 years since the ends of Battle for Zendikar. So I mean, there has been enough time for healing and everyone to kind of settle back down again. And doing a little day in the life of might not have worked for Zendikar. We want to go back and have this big ballsy kind of story arc, and it did at first feel jarring to have this. Suddenly we've got this whole new MacGuffin that can do things like fix the plane, which is literally like retcon on a stick, kind of thing. But beyond that, I think this nice contained story did do the plane a lot of justice. It did the planeswalkers a lot of justice. It did the denizens of the plane itself a lot of justice. So I think it was a really nice, good way of going, cool, I guess this is kind of what we always wanted to show Zendikar to be. And despite all of the nonsense we had to get through to get here, we can still do a nice contained story that doesn't have to be, a world-ending apocalypse, even if it does still have a hint of, well, this core could cause, the end of the plane. But that's a perspective opinion, that's Nissa's opinion, and Nahiri's opinion, rather than the fact that you can genuinely feel like the globe itself might crack into and fade away.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the story in general, with a lot of its story beats, a lot of its sort of tropes that it was using, has kind of seemed to have gone back to basics as far as fantasy storytelling is going, whereas the characters themselves have been very well written and show a lot of depth within the story arc of the 5 stories. The actual story beats themselves are just there to kind of facilitate these characters kind of doing their thing, which I think is the right idea. One of the bigger problems with things like War of the Spark and even like the Battle for Zendikar era Zendikar stories is that the story that they were trying to tell was so big, as well as trying to do like a lot of characterization, that for literature that is tied to a card game and people want that to sync up nicely, it was maybe just trying to do too much all at once. Whereas this was simple story, have interesting characters, set in the world of Magic the Gathering that we love. You can't really, go wrong too far. It was even things like in episode 2 of the main storyline, where Nahiri goes to find her adventuring party with Akiri, Zareth, Kazza, and Ora. It's the classic D&D thing. It's, you awake in a tavern. You and a bunch of adventurers are chatting about something you're about to go and do. And, everyone has their own motivations. Like, we don't see anything about Kazza and Ora too much, but it's clear that they're like, ballsy adventurers. Zareth wants to maybe keep the Litha form core for himself. He's got his own like little duplicitous thing going on. Ikiri is just there trying to protect her party. And everyone's got their own little motivations. But essentially it is just, do you want to go on a fun adventure? And, that's what we need at the moment. We don't need storylines that go too broadly beyond that, because I think people just want to have their characters back. They want to have Jason, Nissa, and Nahiri back to doing what they do best. And I think this goes a long way. I don't think we're fully there. I think especially characters like Jace, like everyone has their own opinion as what Jace should be. So he's a bit of a tricky one. I do like how they treated Jace in this storyline. So that was the story breakdown, guys, for those of you listening. Now we're just going to kind of talk broadly about all the themes and everything that we kind of think is going on. I want to kick off because I know you have quite a bit to say, but I just want to kind of jump in first with, I really like Jace and his little mini story arc in this 5-story thing, because he is a difficult character to write because he's been a fan favorite for so long. He's had so many different personalities, it seems, especially because a whole sort of chunk of his origin story comes from the fact that he always had his brain wiped, his mind wiped.
He literally has had multiple personalities.
He has had multiple personalities. He's been a villain. He's been a hero. He's been a protagonist. He's been self-doubting. He's been too cocky. Like, he's been a lot of different things over the years. And I feel like this seems like a nice sort of rounding off of his character of acknowledging the fact that he has all these different kind of faces he can put on, but this is him now trying to like level out a little bit. We get a lot from a lot of the characters about how the fallout from War of the Spark, especially when it comes to Gideon's death, for example.
Yeah.
Jason Ahiri often refer to that. Nissa more so. Sorry, Jason Nissa. Nissa more so, but Jace as well, where they kind of, Jace feels he has to now step up to the leadership role in the Gatewatch, and what does that mean for him? And, maybe he has to make some choices that he's not completely happy with, but at the same time, he also needs to learn to listen to other people, because that's what a leader does. He doesn't just run off into the fray. He takes everyone's thoughts into account and makes the best move. And it's all these different little moving pieces in his brain where I think we're going to start seeing a different Jace. I do think there is room for him to become an antagonist in the future. And I think this might come down to his kind of pressure on himself, which is still a very Jace thing. That's something that's very consistent, is he puts a lot of pressure on himself. He's is full of self-doubt because he's essentially a nerd. He's the magic nerd in the story. He's a mind mage. Everything is up here in his brain. He doesn't lead with his heart. So I think there is room for him to maybe not willingly, but maybe accidentally on purpose go
through
down a path.
disassociation or something like that, not having an emotional investment and try to take that objectivity. And obviously the people that have the subjective opinions aren't going to appreciate that objectivity. This is a good example. It happens a lot in this story here of where he's trying to play the middleman, and obviously people don't want the middle reaction. They want their extreme, and the other person wants their extreme, and the person in the middle is never going to make either of those people happy.
For sure. And one of the big things that we find out in these stories is that Nicobolus, obviously we know, is in the prison realm, but we're kind of more explicitly told at this point that the only non-Ugin, the only non-dragon person that knows that Nicobolus is in this prison realm is Jace, and he has this burden of knowledge. And there's a couple of lines that I want to just flag up before, because I know you've got kind of a very broad idea of what these stories are trying to tell, but I just want to flag this little thing up, just kind of having the background. 1 second, I will get it. Oh yes, so it's in episode 4, where from the viewpoint of Jace, he's looking at the lithoform core, and he sees the potential which is hidden inside it. And the line reads, "He also knew that if he was ever going to unlock the mysteries of the core, he was going to have to understand how it was activated. That if it was going to be a useful weapon in the battles to come, its mysterious power had to be quantified first. And he knew that they would need every weapon the planes could offer when they faced Nicobolus again." Now, for all intents and purposes, as far as we know as readers, and as far as most of the characters knows, Nicobolus is depowered and in a prison realm. But Jace, and this isn't the only mention of this kind of thought process from Jace, Jace seems convinced that it's a when they face Nicobolus again, not if something goes wrong. He seems to think that Nicobolus will definitely come back. And whether that's true or not, which is a crazy revelation, really, for readers who have been following the story for the past 2 years, with like the culmination of Nicobolus being defeated being the big sort of thing to cap off like 10 years of storyline, that, his obsession over this might grow in future stories. And I feel like we are going to start seeing a side of Jace which maybe will go too far. There are little flags of it in these storylines where he starts to think about how the lithoform core could be used, and that's part of the initial dispute between him and Nissa, is that she wants to destroy it, whereas he goes, no, we can study it and, try to control it. And he always kind of backs off before he goes too far in these stories. He always goes, oh no, maybe I should listen to Nissa, maybe she is right and she's got the right idea. But I think this is now sowing the seeds for storylines in the future where we see Jace going after weapons and artifacts and maybe starting to become a little bit obsessed with keeping Nicobolus in this prison realm. It's just something to flag up. Obviously it was not hidden information. It's quite a big sort of like pivotal point in one of his stories, but it's something that could be missed with everything else going on.
I think the concern there is that it can be like kind of like Kung Fu Panda, where the only reason why the tiger gets out is because they go to check to see if he's still okay. It's what they think of, like, don't, like, this is my concern that they dropped this in this early, considering it's only been a year or so since we last had Nicobolus. For those that don't know, Nicobolus has died quite a few times already, so it's not as if it's not a precursor for him coming back, and he's probably in one of his best states in terms of like he's not like a random spirit thing that's floating around the Talon gates or whatever like before. So I do think there's a worry that, and I think there's a few people that had this worry that, oh, is it automatically hinting that he's going to immediately be a threat? It's like, no. If anything, this is a Jace perspective thing. This is a Jace thing. This isn't a Nicobolus coming back thing. This is a stating where Jace's state of mind is, where his thought process is. And there's a lot of justifications of people's thought processes in these stories of trying to make them, none of them paint as morally good or bad. They're all kind of neutral in their own fashion. And I think that morally grey area is a really interesting thing, because obviously when it comes to people's opinions, wants, desires, when they clash, typically you have to find a grey area to make those work and marry together. It's very rare that two people's intentions sync up together so well. Maybe this is where the Gatewatch were a bit too kind of, Power Ranger TV, Saturday morning TV show kind of thing, of where it was all like, hey, we'll go and fight this team together, let's go. And yes, okay, throughout all the stories there was nuance as to why different intentions, and obviously Liliana was manipulating them up to a degree throughout Amonkhet and that kind of thing, but there was a degree of black and white to it, and when you're facing an elder dragon, whereas now people's intentions and everything did feel more nuanced. And it's funny to think that, for him, this idea that there's this looming danger, it will probably cloud his judgment on a lot of things and influence his decisions, as it already has in this first story that we've seen him since War of the Spark.
Yeah, 100%. I just think for a Planeswalker that is the background character, like we were kind of right to call that out when we saw the spoilers, and we were kind of like doing our little what we think will happen in the story episodes, which was all baseless conjecture really. But it turns out we were all right at it. Like Nahiri and Nissa were the forefront of the story, with Jace kind of dicking around in the background doing Jace things. But yeah, that's kind of almost like the sub B plot is Jace's little back and forth, and I'm just kind of happy that we have that there, where we have this kind of, it's not just moody Jace, and it's not just, oh, I'm the face of magic Jace. It is something in between, which I think is a good look for him. You have not a theory, but you've kind of been looking at these stories as like a collection of redemption arcs, right?
Well, yeah, I think so. The reason why I liked these stories more than anything else is that we were able to ground a perspective of the Planeswalkers in a very simple story. Had it been a grandiose arc that had gone above and beyond and done something more catastrophic, I don't think we'd have been able to get the nuance. But the whole point seems to be that it's a nice epilogue to kind of how people respond to, guilt and loss and mistakes that they've made. And Jace is less important in this, even though he does technically have this like kind of redemption arc, because he starts with this feeling of this guilt, this weight on his shoulders, this burden of knowledge. There's quite a few random like Infinity War kind of references in this, where like people getting dusted and people like having the burden of knowledge and shit like that. But we're not going to sass on that. The point being that both Nissa and Nahiri both have huge amounts of guilt resting on their shoulders for various reasons. Nahiri specifically, it was nice not to see her just being batshit crazy all the time, because we've seen her not only gallivanting throughout War of the Spark, fighting Sorin, seemingly ignoring Nicobolus completely throughout War of the Spark, and then also seeing her summon bloody Emrakul to Innistrad, which we'll address the Eldrazi in the room about that in a little bit as well, because I think that was a silly thing to ignore. But there's a line there specifically that says, the guilt of her failures haunted her. And if you think about Nahiri, every single thing we've seen her do has been a reaction to the mistakes that she made in the past. She, in her mind, feels completely and utterly responsible for the fact that she allowed the Eldrazi to remain on Zendikar. And I know there is some back and forth as whether or not the Royal existed before or not, but I mean, the Royal was only so aggressive and so dangerous because it was like a body's reaction to a virus. It was the kickback against the Eldrazi presence on the plane. And even though the Eldrazi have been defeated, they are still, the Royal still exists. And it's still a constant reminder. It haunts her, this idea of the things that she did wrong, and how to get Zendikar back to the place it was before she allowed all of this shit to happen. She was let down by Ugin, she was let down by Sorin. Everything's just in this massive disappointment, this expectation subverted, that she thought she was doing something good, and all it's done is fuck everything that she loved up. And to this day, as much as there isn't really, she doesn't get a point of humility over the Eldrazi situation. There is still a lot of you on the shoulders. She still feels very personally responsible. In the same fashion, Nissa has the same idea of where she's trying to mend. Not mend Zendikar, but she wants, because she also freed the Eldrazi in the first place. This is a strange dichotomy between Nahiri and Nissa about what their perspectives are, their wants, and their maturity in handling their problems. Nissa, throughout the whole story, has this lovely redemption arc of being able to grow as like emotionally as a person. The fact that she's going, oh, what would Gideon do? It's not, I mean, yeah, that's a meme in of itself, but the idea is that Gideon was this righteous, steadfast beacon of morality, and Nissa is learning how to kind of have the confidence in herself to do things. Like it's the little things, like every now, she reassured Jace at one point when he tried to break into Nahiri's mind that it was the right call to do. You know, the fact that she's willing to be emotionally supportive of other people, the fact that she's willing to be independently strong, like this black streak in her is probably exactly what she needed to have the confidence and the strength to believe in herself, considering she is, out of the three of them, probably the most powerful, especially on Zendikar.
Yeah, the black isn't a self-centered sort of aspect. The black in her kind of new Golgari card could be sort of seen as being a self-assured, because that's really all like self-centeredness really is. It's just a toxic form of self-confidence, right? Like anyone can be like, you know, self-centered if all they think about is themselves. So, you know, maybe we're finding a kind of slice of the black color pie where, you know, self-centeredness is really just a flip side of the coin from self-confidence. And there's you're right, she repeats the mantra throughout all the stories, and this is why it's actually really nice to have one writer again doing these 5 chapters together. She uses this mantra of what would Gideon do, as you said, and then there's a line in the very last story right before she uses the lithiform core to fix Zendikar in her own way. It says, what would Gideon do? No, what would I do? And it's this idea that, you know, Gideon is dead. He isn't talking to her. He's not giving her information. She's using the what would Gideon do mantra to give herself the confidence to do what she thinks is right, until she realizes that what she actually needs is just to have the confidence to do what she needs to do. And what would Gideon do? Gideon would believe in himself, which is what she decides to do. It's really nice. And I don't know how much, so 80 green black, I don't know how much like of a resource they gave them. I don't know like how far back they did their research, but whatever they did, I think they really nailed what the aftermath of War of the Spark should have been. And where the hell were these stories 2 years ago? Why did we get War of the Spark Forsaken and not get, you know, what would Gideon do?
Why were we Forsaken? It's a good question.
Yeah, but, the answer is fucking money. But, you know, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also interesting that I like the fact that the little thing that Jace doesn't mean. I mean, Jace has grown as a character, and no, he hasn't gone back to his typical twattishness that he used to have of not being able to care about other people. But it's funny that because of his focus, he still stumbles into the same issues, and because Nissa doesn't quite. Because of Nissa's maybe overconfident at this point, there is this degree of where he's letting her down. There's a little betrayals that instead of breaking her down, they build her up, they build her confidence up until she gets to the point of where she is, you know, I mean, she always has been this like kind of she is the guardian of the current Zendikar, as much as Nahiri at the beginning has a great deal of belligerent confidence. You know, this is my plane, I will heal it. And at the beginning, Nissa is willing to defer to her because as far as she's concerned, that she is this older, more powerful planeswalker, this more ancient protector of Zendikar, and who is she to, you know, chat back at her? But it's a strange power struggle between the two of them going through the episodes, because at the beginning, Nissa even compliments Nahiri, being like, "Oh, the way you use your stone in War of the Spark was really, really cool." And then Nahiri turns around and goes, "Yeah, good job with that tree." And it's like, oh wow, are you gonna go? That's so cold. And it's funny because even within an episode, that power dynamic switches entirely, and it is that confidence that Nissa has. Whereas Nahiri, deep down, she's probably really unconfident. Like everything she's done has been a betrayal. She has nothing supporting her ideology. Even like Ikoria and the Adventuring Party, when she eventually gets a party around her that do have some reverence to her when she kind of states her planeswalker ability. Even they eventually betray her, and she has to kind of turn against them. Like my biggest thing coming out of this is, where does Nahiri go from here? Every single thing has disappointed and let her down. Even though what she kind of wanted to happen with the core by the end of it, the fact that Nissa was able to heal the plane in a way that wasn't destructive to anything, Nahiri's still bitter because it wasn't her that fixed it. She didn't get a solution. She didn't get a fucking finalization to her arc. Unfortunately, she did have, if anything, she was the one who didn't get to be redeemed, because by the end of it, she still didn't get to have that point where she admitted fealty to anything, even to her own emotions, to her own guilt, to her own actions. And that's an interesting thing, because I don't know where she goes. I think maybe it's funny because right at the end, Jace throws up a Sorin illusion when they're having a little bit of a tussle, and it's the breaking point that allows Nahiri, that kind of makes Nahiri stop and gives Jace the upper hand. And it's funny that she still has such a deference to Sorin, that her master is still haunts her to the point of where, because clearly Jace, all he did have to do is peek a little bit into your brain, know your fears, and it'll manifest them, and it will affect you in the greatest fashion. He even says in one of is that this is what he's doing against the elementals, is conjuring illusions of fire and Eldrazi, because that's what Zendikar naturally fears, which is, looking at it and how far that can go, is super dangerous. This is why Jason, interesting character, you can't go too far with mental powers because they're really, really strong. But it is funny that, she still has this fear of Sorin, this idea that he still slighted her. And we got no resolution. Not only we did not know how he got out the rock, but we got no resolution, no story of anything that happened. We don't know any of the words that they spoke to each other. And yet we start this story with that all being over. They did at some point say bye and go their separate directions. We still don't know. But the fact that this is still looming in her mind makes me feel like hopefully that's something that we might see in the future, that she tries to get some emotional resolution to things, because she has nothing else left to fight anymore. Everything, as far as she's concerned, it's fixed.
Nahiri is an interesting one because, this is an opinion that I've had for quite a while, and I've joked about it on this podcast before. Like, as a character, as a planeswalker, and as someone who's like a face of the game, Nahiri's like a really well-liked character. People think she's badass, which she is. She's got cool abilities. She's like, the core race is like really cool, and like they do stonework. She's got these like blazing swords, and like she kicks.
She's the Boris planeswalker, which I like.
Yeah. She's really cool, but she is also a complete and utter asshole.
She's megalomaniac.
She destroyed a plane out of spite. She blames everyone else for her problems, despite them having relatively good reasonings. She just goes, no, fuck yous. And, I think these stories, they could have had everyone be super cool and, like, hey, I'm the antagonist, but I'm still here to sell the game. And, hey, I'm the protagonist, but I'm still kind of edgy. But, Greenblatt really went in with showing just how toxic Nahiri can be. As you say, like, she brushes away Nissa's compliments, like, as a complete arse. And there's one line, it's my favorite line in all of the stories, and it's during the culmination of the climactic battle, and it's the episode 5, because the battle kind of lasts across episodes 4 and 5. The line is, broken doesn't mean weak, Nahiri, replied Nissa. Broken doesn't mean that there isn't beauty in redemption. So says the broken planeswalker, retorted Nahiri. What a dick!
Right? And this might be one of the best representations of psychological representations of the colours of mana. So we have a red-white who's kind of going with the order, but also has the rash, impulsive, reckless nature. You've got the green-black planeswalker who's looking to do the solidarity of nature and how the ecosystem should be furthered, but with again, like that individualistic approach to it. And then you've got the blue mage in the middle who's trying to balance the two together and clearly is doing a very poor job of it. So psychologically, like, this is a really good representation of all the colours of Magic and how they would handle problems and handle maybe the same problem in different fashions. But yeah, it's very interesting to think, because that's one of the things I think that the reason I ended these stories on a real high note is because there was this idea of some scars are necessary, like I'm back in college. One of the first things I wrote as a creative piece was this idea of scars talking to their owners, and how like the scars don't blame their owners for what they did. It's the fact they're keeping them alive. The scars are there as reminders of the folly, reminders of the hardship, reminders of the triumphs, and the fact that the whole point is this representation of the differing approaches to fixing your mistakes. And it's nice that Nissa got a cathartic and empathetic fashion of winning over Nahiri's stubborn retconning of a plane just because you have some, backwards nostalgia. That was essentially the idea of it. They both have this idea of what perceived of what should be, but one of them is trying to go to ignore all of the progression, ignore all of the hardship, whereas Nissa's willing to admit and lean into, look, some things are broken. Like it's like Star Wars where when Kylo Ren fixes his mask but leaves all the cracks, and people like that because it shows that he understands and wants to celebrate the action of breaking it to be able to reform it and fix it, but do it in a fashion that does celebrate the journey that it took to get there. Not ignoring everything and going, hey, it's fine, whatever. We're back to old school days.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. Like A.T. Greenblatt's not a UK writer; they're an American. At least that's what my research has said. The reason I mention this is that what's going on in the UK right now in terms of, this is something I've mentioned before, in terms of sort of, the kind of nationalism idea, the kind of harking back nostalgia for an older time. There's this kind of perception in the UK where our politics seems to want us to like rewind the clock and go back to sort of politics and ideals of a bygone era where everything was, wonderful and nice and people were safe and you didn't have all these issues which we have now with things like multiculturalism and, asylum seekers and, policies and politics and political correctness and all this kind of stuff, which is perceived as being like just the issues of of the new wave of liberalism, which, whatever your political dealings are, I think it's very hard to deny that there's this kind of old versus new thing. And I think this is happening a lot in the world. And I did see in this writing, this is why I sort of say she's American and not UK, because I wonder if they had this in mind when they wrote these stories, because some of the language that they use between Nyssa and Nahiri throws up this kind of battle of old versus new in my head, even down to just like individual words. There's a point of view from Nahiri, who I sort of see as being the older, sort of like, well, I want things to go back to the way I remember them, because that's when I was safe and I was happy, versus Nissa's newer, as you say, the cracks and the broken elements of our society are things that we need to be aware of, but they're also what makes our society now, and we need to
they're the foundations of what we have now.
Yeah, and there's a line that's from Nahiri's point of view where she says, no, not nothing. She had strength and determination. She had mastered stone. She had survived for millennia. She was the guardian for the real ancient Zendikar. She was the protector of the bedrock of the foundation of this world. And she would stop this madness. Now, the real Zendikar and the use of the word madness, like, I don't know if this, people can tell us on Twitter or whatever, but there's definitely this thing in the UK where lefty liberals used to mock right-wingers, where they right-wingers say the phrase, oh, it's just PC gone mad. It's just political correctness. It's just multiculturalism gone mad. And that's the kind of stereotypical response to anything where if people tell you not to be a racist asshole anymore, oh, it's just PC gone mad. I can't say anything nowadays, And just this characterization of Nahiri of, she's not wrong to want to go back to those times, because that is when she... when her guilt didn't exist, and this is something we've said before. So you can't blame her for wanting to go back to these times, and it's nice to see things through the eyes of one of these characters. But essentially, that is what she's trying to do, and it's, on a larger political spectrum, I think a lot of the issues from leftist politics and right wing politics is that it's very hard to see things from other people's perspectives, and to empathize,
especially if you're not willing to listen.
Yeah, exactly. So to have this writing and to see these characters where, yes, Nahiri is a crazed arsehole who will do anything to get her own way, but also she's not fully outside the realms of reasoning. Like, we understand why she wants to do this. It's just her ways of going about it is just so black and white that it leads to these problems. Whereas Nyssa, as we say, represents the fractured, not perfect, yes, things need to be worked out, but still beautiful and wholly welcoming aspects of the royal wrecked Zendikar.
Well, I think that's grounded in the story, because obviously Nyssa is more directly connected. She's specifically connected to the world soul of Zendikar, whereas Nahiri, even with the core in her hand, doesn't listen to the whispers. She completely ignores. And what you learn is that the core is a part of Zendikar, and she's even willing to ignore Zendikar talking to her to fix Zendikar. Now, if that isn't a broken ideology, I don't know what is. And the whole reason why Nyssa, because Nyssa didn't even want to use the core, but as soon as it starts talking to her, she's like, no, this is me. I am you. We are all one. And the whole point is that Nyssa is part of Zendikar. And as much as she understands that the royal is a necessity because of, I guess she doesn't want to fuck the status quo up. But the point is that the royal technically isn't part of the status quo. But if she could, directly communicate, and that was the nice thing at the end that I think was the switch up. Now it's been a few weeks. I don't think of it as much, but it was a bit of a rug pull where right at the end, instead of it culminating in a fashion that we expected it to, Nyssa uses the core, and I don't think anyone really saw that coming. But we also didn't see the core switching up from being a weapon to actually being it genuinely is meant to heal. It's just Nahiri's not understanding. She's not listening to even the core that she came from, the ancient core that she derived from, that she's trying to revert this back to. She's not even listening to them, and that's a good indication of people, in modern society, where they don't even listen to the plight that they're in, the country that they're sitting, and they need to understand that there is a perspective outside of their own. And if you're not willing to listen to it, how the hell are you going to find any understanding or any kind of gratification in this world? And this is the thing that's funny. Nahiri still bitterly scowls and planeswalks away. It's like she still hasn't had any what's the word I'm thinking of? Not therapeutic.
Clarity. She hasn't had. Yeah, I know what you're trying to say. Catharsis.
Thank you. Yeah, it's no catharsis for her whatsoever, because it hasn't worked out the way she wanted. But she needs to realize that her perspective isn't the only perspective, and if she is fighting for just herself, maybe she needs to go and fix her problems on an individual basis rather than try and fix her problems by changing an entire fucking plane, and fighting everyone belligerently to do so. That was the interesting. Yeah, it's funny that I hadn't really thought about it in terms of like big like outside world views, but I think most medias these days will do a little bit of that anyway. They'll have a bit of real world representation, because that's just how the world works, and it's a good way to speak to your audiences. And I think it's an interesting analogy to make, because there's very much a time right now where we have people trying to fight for revolution, even if it's subtle revolution rather than being massive reformation and things like that happened in the past. But there is a massive slew of people, like even the basic thing of wearing a mask, in the current climate. If there are people fighting against that, then fucking what? How can you make the world better when people are fighting against basic sensibility?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and it's also interesting coming back to the story of like the lithoform core being used as a force to fix Zendikar, is that there was an element of Nissa maybe in her own blindness not understanding that the stone of the ancient core races is still Zendikar. Like, yes, it's ancient Zendikar, and yes, maybe the times have changed, but the core race are still part of the plane. She forgets that they're still part of the world that she belongs to. So I think the switch up of the lithoform core being so powerful that it can also channel the voice of Zendikar alongside the elemental representation of a Shire, I think it was a really nice mashup of going, the only way we fix the world is by coming together and by having these two sort of diametrically opposed forces work in unison with one another. It was really nice.
The only way it worked is because the core literally turned around to us and went, no, shut up, listen to me. And Nissa was actually willing to go, oh, yeah, sure, I'll listen, because Nissa's still Nissa. Whereas Nahiri only heard it as like basic, whispering, is because she was so, tunnel visioned on her own idea. And yeah, it's this is what I liked about the core, is it was basic. This is why I've been really interested to see what happened if Jace had used, well, I kind of maybe not actually, but it was interesting to see that this core does reflect and express the vision of the person holding it, which is why it had such a positive reaction when it was held by Nissa. I think it was a very clever way to ground a big it could have there could have been massive fallout from this. It had gone the wrong way. It could have culminated a much longer story arc if we needed it to, but it didn't. It grounded it within the personal conflicts of these three planeswalkers and their residual guilt over various different acts and actions that have happened. Like it's the fact that we're still reflecting on people like Gideon and how to move forwards with grief and how to fix your problems and everything like that. Like the last line of the entire story is that he hoped that what Nissa said was true, that broken things could be redeemed. That's such a nice sentiment to last on, because I think that was the whole point, is that you're going through these stories kind of not knowing who's necessarily right. I mean, I think for the most part you're supposed to believe that Nissa's the correct person because she's doing the best she can to be serving to the plane itself, whereas I know that Nahiri is serving the people, but we don't actually get a lot of the people going, yeah, go Nahiri, that's a much better idea, even though there is a little bit of that.
Well, I mean, actively we have characters trying to stop her when they see like kind of her attitude towards it.
I think exactly.
I think Nissa is the reason Nissa is presented, and I think rightly so, as the one who's righteous, is because she's trying to progress Zendikar, whereas Nahiri is trying to be reductive. She's trying to reverse it. She's reversal, which can't happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's all the stuff that we love about it. We don't have much time left. I know there's a few kind of things which we need to touch on in terms of maybe things that were maybe slightly missed about the story. I mean, I'm going to sort of prefix this by saying I don't think anything which I know to be our issues with it take away from this being a really triumphant return to the web fiction. I think this was absolutely needed. Everything that was done. Like I would accept this web series again and again and again if they said, "Oh, we don't want to change it up." I wouldn't have any issues. But I know there are a few things that the community en masse maybe wished was touched on a bit more, and there's a couple of things that we think if they did mention it a little bit longer, maybe if they had a couple more episodes to tell these stories, it would have been nice to touch on these things. So why don't you kick us off, Nath?
Cool. Well, I'm going to kick off literally on a segue of that last point you said. That I think what they should have done is that they should have obviously being very commanding in my Nahiri aspect of things. I think it would have been better if they finished the last episode on a culmination of the fight, and then we could have had another episode of Fallout. This is one thing I think that they don't do a lot of times in Magic stories, and I've thought about this going back to the other stories as well. Is you very rarely get the almost like the Forsaken epilogue to stories, of where you don't get the episode afterwards go, right, that was the story arc, now where are we going after that, where is everyone's feelings? I mean, yeah, okay, it ends on a nice punchy line, but we don't really, I'd like to have seen a bit of like, okay, now it's over, that's it, done. I would have liked, no, let's sit on it, let's sit on the victory for a little bit, see what waves and the ripples that like finish off of, maybe like extend that out a little bit more, because then it gives us a bit more of a settled conclusion, rather than it feeling like it's just done in an instant and then that's it, cool, maybe we'll see these characters again in a couple of years. So I think that's my main point. Is I think that 5 episodes was maybe a bit too short. I would have liked the whole of episode 5 to have been just the battle, and then you could have had a bit of residual fallout afterwards to kind of see a perspective of maybe like now where Nahiri feels like not just, oh fuck, this isn't what I wanted. I mean, yeah, cool, I guess we won. Go team. Planes walks away. No, let's sit on her emotions for a little bit. Let's understand how she feels now that she's technically had a victory that isn't hers. How do we feel about Nissa? Let's see some pride from her. Let's actually have her bask in her glory for a little bit, and then maybe see potentially what Jace is going to think of, maybe looking keenly into a story going forwards. That kind of idea, I think, was something that maybe was a bit missed. Like maybe the end felt a bit rushed to me.
For sure. I think I agree with that. I think, yeah, maybe just an episode too short. I understand that 5 episodes and then 4 of a side story is 9 articles, but yeah, maybe just a little bit of maybe a little bit more of how things kind of finished off, rather than just battle's done, Zendikar's fixed, everyone goes off into the sunset, whatever. I agree. The other thing which I think they could have maybe touched on a teeny bit more, and I say a teeny bit because I've gone on record on this podcast and on Twitter as saying I don't think it was important that they delve too deep into it, but maybe just a little bit, is yes, maybe the Eldrazi influence on the plane should have been explored a touch more, just a wee bit. Because there was a lot of cries in the community when the cards started being released, and when the first couple of stories were released, that a lot of people who were maybe a bit more vocal about what they wanted from the story were like, this is ridiculous. They've had the plane destroyed literally by these Eldrazi Titans, and we haven't had word one about it. And that's not strictly true, because in a lot of the stories, especially, and the side stories as well, where the first 2 where we explore Zareth and Akiri's relationship, they do talk heavily about the emotional and mental toll of the Eldrazi wars in, like, for them as characters. And we do see and hear a lot about certain communities and certain locations on Zendikar which has still been ravaged by the Eldrazi menace. But they really, really went out of their way not to tell that story at all in the mainline sort of story. Which I think, honestly, overall, I think was probably a smart idea. And you can't tell every story with every go, like, round the Magic story merry-go-round. Like, you have to pick your battles.
Yeah.
But I think maybe just the one nice touch with, you mentioned about Sorin, Jace summoning an image of Sorin to distract Nahiri, and he summoned some fire to distract the elementals, is that, yeah, he also does summon Eldrazi scions and Eldrazi spawns to have the elementals like flee and cower in fear, which I think is a nice little touch. So we see a lot of the emotional baggage left by the Eldrazi, but we don't see anything like a giant Eldrazi structure still being there, or like, people using the Eldrazi as armor and shit like that.
I think the only thing we get a little bit when Jace goes to Seagate. Obviously, he goes to the memorial, which is quite nice, and then you get a bit of Mara, who has the corruption on her face, and there's a pang of guilt from Jace there, and there's a little bit of discussion. I mean, it's mentioned enough. I also kind of take away back to where you're talking about Ikoria and Zareth. I think it's good that they did these kind of grounded story arcs outside of the main arc, because as you say, you don't have enough time to tell all these stories within one story arc. But getting Zareth and Akiri, because most of Akiri's characterization comes from trying to fix things, not in the same kind of way as Nahiri, but with a much more clarity and sensibility, and you wouldn't have been able to fit all of that into the main story arc. So it was quite nice getting those 2 separate stories to then be able to funnel in. So if you did only read the first 5 and you really liked the story arc, but you kind of felt that maybe Zareth and Akiri were a bit underdeveloped, go read those other 2, because they really delve deep into it and kind of give a personal, grounded reflection that isn't just planeswalkers doing planeswalky things. So yeah, I think it could have been touched on more. Maybe it could have felt like a little bit like it wasn't being ignored, and especially now the Lithoform core has done its thing, we're probably never going to really see any Eldrazi influence ever again on Zendikar, which is fine to a degree, but as far as I was concerned, the entire continent of Balaged was grey. So the fact that we're never going to get that really mentioned again don't get me wrong, we've said this again before on podcast about how this did feel like the best way to retcon a story that you could possibly do it, in a way that it doesn't completely divorce the plane from its previous story, but it doesn't reflect on it too much either. So yeah, I felt like it was the right kind of middle ground, but it did feel maybe if you were into that kind of thing, it would have felt quite lacking.
It was just, I mean, as much as, I didn't necessarily want them to tell that story, it did just feel like they were actively going out of their way not to have, not have anything going on. The other thing, which I think, again, this is a kind of, not an ignoring choice, but maybe it was an odd choice to go with certain characters. As much as Nahiri was the only choice for the antagonist for this set, it is still really weird that we keep getting Nahiri's story without knowing how Soren got out of that fucking wall.
Oh God, don't! Yeah, I know.
How did he get out of the wall?
What happened? I just want a Soren perspective of like, I want like a Dear Diary, day 47 in the wall. We have, that kind of thing. Like, obviously that's too tongue in cheek, and it's not going to happen. And maybe there's probably some fan fiction out there of it. But like this is the thing that we as Vorthosians need, is that we don't need the story itself to be amazing. We don't need the words to be amazing. We don't need their reactions to be amazing. We just need to know the facts, the actions that happen, so we can kind of clarify in our mind why the people are doing things. The next time we see Soren, we have no perspective on, is he angry? Is he pissed off? Is he just disappointed? Did he have a little cry to himself about how he let down a hero? We don't know any of these things. We have no idea. Not a Scooby-Doo. So so that's that to that point. Yeah, I agree. I also think talking about things that Nahiri's done that don't get extrapolated on. The brush aside that Nissa makes about, so after what you did on Innistrad is literally almost like, right. And then she does and goes, yeah, but you let them out on Zendikar. And this is like, yeah, fair dues. Like, no, fuck off, fair dues. How can everyone just be like, how can everyone know? I'd rather no one knew that it was Nahiri responsible for the for bringing Emrakul to Innistrad, so they can just kind of ignore it and it can be some guilt that sits on her shoulders. But the fact they actively mention it and then just pass it off as if it was no biggie because, oh no, but it's all fixed now, isn't it? It's like, fuck off, she's still in the moon. That's probably like the biggest threat to the multiverse. So how is that even not, oh God, like, thankfully that got brushed aside like episode 1, so you kind of then ignore it and you're like, oh yeah, Nahiri's trying to fix the plane, cool, go Nahiri. But you forget the fact that you fucking, I don't know, it's insane to think that it could be brushed aside so easily when someone like Nissa would definitely care about someone bringing an Eldrazi to another plane, considering the whole arc of this is the fact that they were both responsible for the Eldrazi being on Zendikar. Like, that to me felt really strangely handled, where I guess again I would have rather them ignored it, because then, like with the Eldrazi being on Zendikar, and we kind of ignored that and it didn't feel badly handled. It's better to ignore something and not handle it poorly than to address it and handle it poorly. I don't want a bad reminder of something. I'd rather have the opinion in my mind and it not be addressed, so I don't have to change my mind on it and readjust. But to then readjust it so negatively is insane. I can't believe they did that.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, again, this is just, it wasn't the story they wanted to tell. They needed to fit a narrative in to presumably what they knew was going to be X amount of words, which was going to go into X amount of story articles. So all of these gripes, as I said, not 5 minutes ago when we started doing these, I genuinely think that these are all just us Vorthos nerds going, but I want to know the story. Like, actually for what they were trying to do, they didn't need to have any of that information, and what they gave us was pretty good. I'm not trying to also let WotC off the hook for their terrible handling of the story. Like, I'm not trying to be like, oh, you've finally given us the nectar, like, thank you so much. The stories can and will hopefully get better, and they'll refine their process, and they'll keep supporting these writers who are relatively unknown in the game as far as Magic goes, and keep pushing forward. So that's how we get the Kate Elliots and the Django Wexlers of our game, is we give them like an in-house team, and we give them the support to tell these stories in the right way, and then we have these writers on side, so hopefully they'll keep going. I think that's going to do it for us. I mean, I think I'm happy. I'm happy with it, and it sounds so rare to say it in Magic at the moment, but I am really happy with the web fiction. I hope it keeps going forward, as you said, and as I think I've read somewhere too. We're not going to get similar stuff for Commander Legends. I don't know how that would have even worked. Like, what were they going to do? 70 web stories, one for each legendary.
I would getting like a Baron Senga story, like of just like a day in the life of kind of thing. That would have been an interesting. But I guess also at that point, you're then either talking about characters that are super precious to people that have a lot of fiction from back in the day, but maybe you would have ruined potential. Like a nostalgia from the older players, whilst the newer players don't really, as much as like, okay, newer players go open up Commander, like, who the fuck's Baron Senga? You can go and find out. You don't need a little story to kind of maybe accidentally poorly demonstrate it or not give. I mean, as much as it is going to be annoying not to have some kind of catharsis of some of the stories here, like I think there'll be some characters that would be like, oh, but I really want to know what they're up to now or what they were up to then. I think maybe it's better not to potentially ruin them. So.
I think they said that they were going to do flavor in some description, whether that's just the lore slides or maybe like a one shot. Like, who knows? I don't want to sit here and like conjecture about what they may or may not do, because quite frankly, I'm just happy that we have some solid Magic story that I can actually find on their website. Because they did have, I think we've mentioned this in the State of the Story episode way back, like almost a year ago now, that they had everything from Tarkir forwards, but everything after Tarkir, like that was previous to Tarkir story-wise, is still exists as a web page on their website. But God fucking hell, if you can find it without having to go to Google and typing in the exact thing you want to find. Now they don't even have Tarkir on there. Like,
I was trying to find a Scars and Mirrodin one when you mentioned earlier about. I was like, I swear there was a story arc for Scar. Bugger if I could find it in the 5 minutes whilst we were talking at the beginning.
No. I think you have to Google it, which is a bit of a shame. But hopefully they've now kind of gone, right, we're going to start like a new era of web fiction where we're going to be uploading it properly and keep going. So yeah, there we go. So I think 50 steps forward, maybe 7 steps back, but that's still 43 steps forward. So there we go. Cool. Other than that, guys, if you want to talk to us about the storyline or anything to do with Magic Flavor Design and Lore, you can find us on Twitter at mtflavouring, where we're having lore discussions daily. We're having flavor discussions. I'm also putting up stupid polls that have almost nothing to do with Magic, but I get bored and I have access to the Twitter, so that's what I do. Please go hit that follow button so you can support us on that social media platform, and also so we can see who's listening and see who's kind of engaging with our content. It's always really nice to hear. We are growing as a podcast. We are getting new listeners every day. One of the best ways, guys, and this is a call out to anyone who is a long-time listener, or maybe if you're new and you really like our channel and our podcast, is to tell a like-minded friend, whether it's down your LGS or if you can get to one nowadays, or whether it's with a play group that you play with. Maybe they're not into podcasts, maybe they're not particularly into Wartho stuff, but they're, it's either one or the other, and you want to kind of get them something new. We always love having new listeners, and I think our kind of content is the kind of content which new listeners could maybe get some benefit out of without it being too heavy and too monolithic, because there is a lot of Magic lore out there. Our emails will go to mtflavouring@gmail.com. My personal Twitter is @AndyManface. Nathan's, yours is?
At the Fox in the Moon.
I haven't mentioned in quite a while, we do also have a YouTube channel, which is Magic the Flavouring on YouTube. If you want to go and hit that subscribe button, we have flavor cracker packs. We have our interview episodes go up there in video form as well. And we also have a couple of lore videos. There's one really cool one, which Nathan scripted, about the history of the Tronlands, which, objectively, as someone who isn't on I do this podcast with Nathan. Nathan's my best friend. But even if none of that was true, that video and the information in there is really cool. Nathan did a fantastic job on that video. So I think you should go check it out. No worries. Thank you. Other than that, Nathan, do you have anything final to say?
No, I don't think so. I'm currently trying to build a Princess Mononoke deck, so if anyone out there is really into Ghibli and into Magic, hit me up on Twitter with some suggestions. I need even more things to overthink and debate over, so yeah, if you want to.
For sure, yeah. We'll do a little post out and see what kind of things we can get. But the only way you'll be able to see that post, guys, is if you follow us on Twitter. So hit that follow button on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is a cesspool. It's but if you're already in the cesspool, if you're having an account, please come
in it, splash around.
Yeah, splash around with us, maybe help give us a float to kind of keep us above the bloody mire. Anyway, other than that, we always end on such a cheery note. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for listening. This has been Magic the Flavouring.
We'll see you soon.